Thank you, everybody. I'm Harishnatarajan, speaking to you from London, England, via recording for now, but hopefully I'll get to talk to you in person very, very soon. What I am going to talk about is debating and some of the benefits which you can derive from it, where I think humans' competitive advantage is compared to artificial intelligence, ways of setting debating motions, and ways of preparing cases. Just a brief piece of background about myself and my experiences in debating and out of debating. So as a competitive debater, I debated both for the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge and several other institutions from around the world. In that time, I reached the grand final of the World Universities Debating Championships and won the European Debating Championships. Last year in February, so February 2019, I was invited to speak against IBM's Project Debater. Project Debater was the very first public debate between a human and IBM's artificial intelligence machine and the third IBM Grand Challenge. The first which was back in 1997 between chess champion Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue. And that experience taught me an awful lot and made me reflect an awful lot more about what debating is, what it means to be persuasive, and the skills which we have in abundance. So what exactly is that? What did I learn about artificial intelligence and debating? The first thing I think we've learned, and I just want to speak about this on a more general level, because 20 years from now, 30 years from now, maybe in 3 or 4 years, artificial intelligence and machine learning will be dominant not just in debating, but in the workplace, in academia, everywhere. And we can hear lots of dystopic views about how AI is going to replace human beings. And I don't want to negate or take away from lots of those, but I do want to note that there are limitations in artificial intelligence, and Project Debater highlighted both the strengths of AI and the weaknesses of AI. The first one is that humans do not have a competitive advantage compared to artificial intelligence or machine learning, or even a normal calculator, in data accumulation and data processing. And this, I think, is quite intuitive. Project Debater before a debate, will have in its system 10 million articles. Now, I don't know how long it would take a human to read 10 million articles. I suspect more than a lifetime. And certainly if you were to read them all, you would never remember them all. And that is why I think that if we want to compare humans to AI, it is not going to be on the data processing basis and the amount of data we have. But at least when it comes to being persuasive, so convincing someone else of a position, data may be valuable, but it is not the only important thing. And that is what I learned from my experience, and what I came to a conclusion of when it came to Project Debater. That when you're debating against a machine, you only have a limited amount of time to prepare. You won't have better data than that machine. And if data is all that convincing someone requires, you're going to be losing. What else then does persuading someone else require? I think in its simplest level, debating requires 3 things. Can you frame a debate? That is to say, can you tell us what is important in the debate? And often if you just look through lots of media articles, I think this is equally true for a student or anyone doing any kind of research as it is for a machine. You'll hear lots of arguments, but they won't necessarily be the single important one, or an explanation as to why this should matter the most. They'll be from niche perspectives, from radical perspectives, from the perspective of a lawyer on a particular topic. And all of those are valuable, and for some audiences might be very compelling. But they rarely will say, this is why, at the end of the day, this is the argument you need to care the most about. And I think this is a mistake most debaters make, that we just think, here are lots of arguments, rather than focusing on what is really important in this debate. And that's something which machines struggle with, partly because I think the inputs into that don't really give it an answer as to what is the most important thing. And different people have different opinions about what the most important thing is, and often won't be stated. Second, can you construct a logical argument? And I think project debating can do this quite well. But I think humans can still do it better, which is, can we explain why something is true, why something is important in the context of that debate, and also think about what the responses we're going to get from the other side are. There's no need to just construct an argument in a huge amount of detail if no one actually has a problem with that argument. So it's about being able to think, what would I say in response to that argument? Which I think is a more complicated process than just constructing an argument on a logical basis step by step by step. And currently an area which artificial intelligence struggles at. And finally, can you rebut? Which is, can you hear an argument and be able to respond to it? And I think one thing which many people think about debating, and competitive debating in particular, is that it's all about disagreement, that it's a war between two sides using logic as their weapon. But I actually think the easier way of thinking about debating, it's almost like it's a dance, that what you are trying to do is convince the other side by being reasonable. Being reasonable means being someone who you can reason with. And that will on occasion require you taking or conceding some ground to them. And in a war, that's always going to be negative, because you're going to be losing territory. But in a debate, it can be disarming. Because if you're willing to agree with them, if you're willing to take their most plausible claims and say, yeah, that's true, you're on stronger ground than you would be if you're disagreeing with everything, because you can seem more reasonable about it. So we often think about debating creating these false binaries, that you have to support or oppose a motion. Fair enough, and that has lots of values in terms of the logical skills you get from it. But even in that world, you want to be the reasonable one, the one who seems like they can thinking about both perspectives rather than just pushing their case irrespective of what the other side says. And that is why effective debating often requires agreement. Now, from the UK, one of the questions I often get asked is, how do you effectively teach debating? And this can occur in the schoolroom, which I've had some experience of, but isn't my forte. I have to delve back often into the years I spent as a student, now 13, 14 years ago, or more often in debating clubs, which I have a lot more experience of, having both taught debating at a university level and for the national teams of the Philippines and the Hong Kong team, which competed in the World Schools Debating Championships. But how do we teach debating? And I think there are a couple things I want to note both inside the classroom and in debating clubs. Inside the classroom, I think it's very useful to set basic topics. We'll talk more about those in a moment, where the aim is going to differ depending on what a teacher wants to be doing. In English classes, we could be debating absolutely anything. This was back in my own experience 13, 14 years ago. In other classes, we could be, in biology classes, we could be debating different perspectives, in philosophy, different theories. Debating often, I think, at a deeper level seems like it's about law, political science, economics, but I think in reality, anything where there are two sides can be debated. What is the value of using a debate as a format of teaching? Well, first, you do have to do research for it, and I think that is very valuable. But I think the core of being a good debater is this, that you can make a logical argument roughly in the form of, as a result of this motion, X happens, this is why X happens. X is important. And you are proving that on balance, your side of the debate is correct. And I actually think for any essay-based subject, or any subject where you have to convince someone or advocate a position, i.e. something where you don't simply solve a problem with a defined answer to it, that is a valuable skill to have. And I think that's the thing to always stress, which is, this is what you are trying to do. This is the form of an argument. There are more complex versions of that, but I think that's the core idea of it. Can you prove why something is true, and why it is relevant and important for your debate, bearing in mind, at the end of the debate, the question we are asking, have you proven, on balance, your side of the debate is correct? And the final part of that is, can you present that argument well? And I think we all know the horror stories about these brilliant scientists or mathematicians who know everything they're talking about, but can't convince anyone of them. Well, that's often because they're simply not presenting their arguments in a way which makes sense and coherently to the public. Another important implication of that is to realize that if you have different topics for different members in a classroom, not everyone will know the same amount. And it's actually very difficult to step back and realize what it was like not to know something which you now know. And one of the most powerful things about learning how to debate is the ability to communicate something you know, sometimes which involves specific detail, which won't be accessible to a general, well-educated member of the public, or they won't have access to it, or they won't know it, and still be able to communicate that information to them in a way which is persuasive. Now, why is that different in debating clubs? And I think there are a couple things I would note about if you're coaching a debating team just for debating. Obviously, the skill sets are roughly similar, but you could be doing an awful lot more debating than you otherwise would. The other part of that, though, is that debating does become more complicated more and more that you do it. Partly it's because you change the kinds of preparation time you have. If you have 3 days to prepare for a debate, you've got plenty of time on Google to read a huge number of sources, to have lots of data. If, like for most competitive debates, you get somewhere between 15 minutes and 1 hour to prepare without access to the internet, you are de-stressing, or not stressing as much the importance of data, but more in terms of the construction of logical argument. Now, obviously, if you know that information, and you know what's happening in the world, your arguments are going to be stronger. And it is certainly valuable to try and make sure that in a club of, say, 10 people, all of them are doing some reading around about the world, about things which are happening in their own country. One way of doing that, for instance, is just giving different kids different parts of the world or different subject areas, and every 2 weeks them presenting a A4 one-page handout about the major things which are occurring. But that can be useful, but it's no longer the essential part of debating, or an essential part of debating, because the focus cannot be on research where you have such limited time, and you obviously can't know details about everything. So what then are we focusing on? Well, when you have more times with students, you can work out what they're bad at. Are they weak at working out what is important in a debate, given the other side? So, they may be able to come up with lots of arguments, but do they know which ones really matter, which ones really convince an audience? The truth is that there are very few topics where there's going to be 5 powerful arguments which are definitively going to convince which are going to convince everyone. The reality is there are going to be 2, there might be 3 of them, And can you spot which ones they are, rather than just simply go, here are more arguments, more arguments, more arguments. So are they able to do that, and can they logically think through that? Are they weak in generating or coming up with their own logical, well-made arguments? I think this is a problem that some people struggle from, particularly when they start debating, that they can be very smart kids, but once they're in that room, that there's almost just this mental block. And at which point, it's partly getting them to step away from the specific debate and ask, what are the general principles involved? Is this about free speech? Is this about the power of the state? Is this about the importance of free expression of your religion? And then they can think about that, not just in that debate, not just for those 15 minutes or that 1 hour, but they've already known the arguments, or they've already talked through some of those arguments. And that can often be a very useful kickstart, because if you know the basic arguments immediately and you walk into a debate, you're already partially prepared. And I think it's realizing, as you do more and more debates, that there are going to be several arguments, and several core arguments, which are going to come up again and again and again. And how would you make them better? And finally, are they better at listening or responding to other teams? And I suspect this is the area where lots of people are going to suffer. There's an intuitive reason for that, because when we are debating, or you're in a debate, you're partially listening, partially thinking about responses, but you also think about, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? And it's quite difficult, particularly when you're starting to debate, to be able to do all of that at once. And sometimes I think it just requires hammering the importance of responding. What makes debating different than public speaking, and in many ways more rewarding, is that we do have another side, but that is another side we have to listen to, another side we have to respond to. So it's useful to be able to go, which area are they struggling with, and then think about ways of improving it. Now, what should we debate? What topics should we be setting? I think I've already alluded to the fact that I don't think that debating is only limited to a few narrow subjects. It's not only going to be about politics, it's not only going to be about philosophy. You can set debates about literature, science, economics. Broadly, anything where you can have a reasonable dispute is an area for potential debate. It doesn't necessarily make it a good debating motion, but it is an area for potential debate. Now, what you want to look for when it comes to taking one of those things you find interesting and turning them into an actual debate or a debating motion. I think there'll be four prime tests I would use. First, are there persuasive arguments for both sides? Now, this almost just sounds trivial, right? But I don't think it is that much, because when you set a motion, you've been thinking about this debate for a long time. You probably have some facts behind it. It might be something which you're really passionate about. So the arguments which are obvious to you may not be the arguments which are obvious to someone else. And are there persuasive arguments for both sides, but can you access those persuasive arguments as well? Are there several different arguments, or is this just going to be about one core issue? If it's about one core issue, it doesn't mean it can't be said as a debate, but bear in mind that limitation. You probably don't want to have 3 speakers on each side when they're only going to be able to say the same thing, or maybe respond to that thing. You really want something where there's some level of depth in it. There's more than just one reason. Maybe there'll be 2, maybe there'll be 5. It doesn't really matter that much. It's just that you need to know that there is enough for people to say that you can have a debate. Are the debates accessible without research, particularly in a debating club where you have up to an hour to prep, you don't have access to the internet? Will the people debating have an idea what this debate is about, or be able to reach the arguments? And will it be interesting? Because I think often what is interesting to us may not be interesting to someone else. That doesn't mean it should never be said, debating clearly has an educational value as well. But if those are the only kinds of motions which are set, you probably don't get people to constantly want to continue debating. One final part to note about this is competitive debating is becoming more and more complicated. And this follows naturally from the fact there are thousands of debating tournaments around the world. That if you're a high school kid in the UK, you could be doing a tournament every weekend if you wanted to. Probably most don't, but that would still, if you say do 20 a year, which would be a high number, but not an extraordinarily high number based on some of the kids I know, you'll be doing upward of 100 different debating motions per year. And what I think that implies is, if you're setting motions for some of those tournaments, you'll probably realize lots of the kids have done lots of the basic debates before, and even the basic debates with a twist, or even the somewhat not basic debates. And I think that a trend has developed, both at schools and at universities, to make debating a little bit more complicated. Now, some examples of this, that you have more regrets motions. So, regretting the bombing of Hiroshima, for instance, which involves historical knowledge, which people may or may not have, but also think about the counterfactual. Because it's not simply, here are the bad things which happened, it's what would have happened instead. And these debates can therefore be quite a lot more complicated than simply, this house would ban drugs, or this house would pass a policy. Second, I think that there is more focus on these emerging social issues. We talk so much about these left-wing cultures of millennials. Well, this does mean that we're going to have more debates about Black Lives Matter and the position of minority groups, the position of women within different societies. Now, all that can be very useful, in that I do think it is very useful for us to be able to discuss and talk about these issues, but also from a debating perspective, this is then theory which, as you get further and further along in your debating career, you probably need to know more about. What is set will probably have to influence what you spend your time reading about, and some of these emerging social issues will be part of it. And following from that is there is going to be greater need for outside reading, that you can't simply focus on reading one page of your local newspaper or even your national newspaper all the time. You will have to be reading more widely, just so you're aware of what's happening in popular culture, what's happening with social justice movements, which goes beyond what is going to be said in a few pages of a single paper. Different kids will find different things interesting, which I think is a feature, not a bug, but I think it's just stressing the importance of being able to look at that. And if you get a debate case, so you have a few days to prepare it with your students, how do you do it? And I think this is just a few hints which I think could have possibly improve lots of these prepared debate cases which we get. The first one is, we often spend a lot of time, and this also happens when anyone is doing debating in limited time preparation, focusing on our own case, which is, what do we want to say? Fine. But nowhere near enough time with saying, what will the other side say? How will they respond to this argument? What are the arguments they're going to be making? Because in the end, if debating is about proving on balance your side of the debate is correct, you can do that by creating your own arguments to say positively, here are reasons for why our side is correct, or dealing with the other side's arguments negatively, this is why your side is not correct. And you need to do, in many cases, you'll need to do at least a little bit of both. But because we go into these prepared debates as, oh, we have so much time, let's come up with our case, ask yourself all the time, how would I respond to this argument? What are the weak parts of this argument? How could they respond to the argument? One way of potentially doing that is at least do a skeleton preparation of what the other side of that debate is, which can really help focus you on how can I build my case as best I can, bearing in mind that they're going to be responding to it. Second, there's often an overfocus on data, which is research facts clearly are important, but they're not a substitute for making logical arguments. So that will often be a trend, particularly I think when students often construct their own prepared debates, that they will focus far too much on the data, but make sure they don't forget the arguments. Data supports arguments, it is often not an argument in itself. Sometimes you'll be overly complicated in debates, bearing in mind that judges often will not be listening as intently as you would like them to. Not everything will be comprehended entirely by an audience. Don't make debates more complicated than you have to, at least at an early stage of development. Maybe when a student has learned a lot of debating, has done well at competitions, then you can make debates more complicated and have more intricate arguments. But doing it at an early stage probably means that they will not communicate it sufficiently well and will undercut its power. And finally, one of the biggest problems in preparing for debates is that even though a team could be wonderfully prepared, will they then listen to the other team? Can they adapt to arguments, responding to arguments or frames they have not responded to? And I think this is the difficult part of it. Construct the best case you can, but make sure that we know that when another team speaks, we need to listen. And maybe we're prepared for it, and on occasion we haven't. But they need to recognize that and still be able to respond. So I hope you found this 27 minutes useful. Please feel free to ask questions whenever you can.